You know someone like this. They used to answer within the hour. Now weeks pass in silence. No explanation, no falling out, nothing anyone can point to and call a reason. Everyone assumes something happened to them. But nothing happened to them. Something happened inside them, quietly enough that even they may not remember the exact day it started. It tends to happen most to a particular kind of person, the ones who read too much, who ask questions no one once asked at dinner, who somehow got sharper and stiller in the same stretch of years. Buried in the research on intelligence and friendship is one detail that rarely survives being repeated online, and it isn't the detail everyone assumes explains the disappearing. The assumption usually goes like this: they got successful, or they got smart, and success or intelligence made them arrogant. They started finding old friends boring. They started treating the people who knew them before as beneath them now. It's a tidy story. It has just enough truth in a few individual cases to feel like a universal law, and the people left behind often build entire narratives around it. A falling out that never actually happened, a slight that was never delivered, a superiority that was never felt. But the story falls apart under any real scrutiny, because when you actually ask the people who withdraw like this how they feel about the people they left behind, contempt is almost never the answer. Tiredness is. Not tiredness of people, exactly. Something more specific than that, something most of them can't name until long after it's already changed their life. In 2016, the psychologist Satoshi Kanazawa and his co-author Norman Lee published a finding that gets cited constantly and understood rarely. Working from a large study of young adults, they found that for people with higher measured intelligence, socializing with friends more frequently was associated with lower life satisfaction. The reverse of the pattern found in the general population, where more frequent socializing almost always predicted more satisfaction. Quoted on its own, that sounds like confirmation of the arrogant story. Smart people simply enjoy people less. But that's exactly the detail that gets stripped out in every retelling. The finding was never that intelligence made friendship less valuable. It was that frequency, specifically, stopped delivering the reward it delivers for nearly everyone else. Frequency and depth are not the same currency, and mistaking one for the other is how this gets misread every time. Consider what frequent, casual socializing actually asks of a person. It asks for performed interest in things you may not care about, easy agreement with things you privately doubt, a kind of low-grade cheerfulness sustained across an evening that never quite goes anywhere below the surface. Most people manage this without much cost, because for most people, the performed self and the private self aren't standing very far apart. But for someone whose inner world has grown more layered, through solitude, through reading, through the slow accumulation of questions that don't resolve, the gap between the two selves widens. And every hour spent performing the narrower one starts to register as a small, specific tax. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott named this split decades before anyone was measuring it in terms of friend groups and group chats. He described a false self, not a lie, exactly, but a protective front built early in life to manage a world that couldn't always meet the true self where it actually lived. The false self isn't fraudulent. It's functional. It gets a person through rooms the true self was never built to survive intact. The trouble is that it was only ever meant to be a shell around something else. A shell worn constantly, with nothing underneath it ever getting to breathe, stops feeling like protection. It starts feeling like a very quiet, very polite form of suffocation. Here is the thing worth sitting with. The people who vanish are rarely running from connection. They are running from the version of themselves that connection used to require. Picture a woman named for no one in particular. The one who, for a decade, was the friend everyone called first. She answered every message within the hour. She organized every trip. Not because anyone had hurt her, because she had started, almost by accident, to notice the effort it took to be the version of herself that made her useful to a room, and once noticed, that effort became impossible to unsee. She hadn't stopped caring about the people. She had simply run out of the surplus required to perform being available to everyone and still have anything left over to be present with anyone. None of this belongs to intelligence alone, though intelligence tends to accelerate it. The way a sharper lens makes a small crack in glass impossible to stop noticing once it's been seen. What actually drives the disappearing is depth, the sheer weight of unexamined inner life a person is suddenly required to carry once they can no longer look away from it. In 1571, at 38, Michel de Montaigne withdrew from public and legal life into a stone tower on his family's estate in southwestern France. In the library at the top of that tower, he had more than 50 maxims from classical writers carved directly into the ceiling beams. Lines on the instability of judgment, the narrowness of certainty, the nearness of death. He wasn't fleeing people in some dramatic, wounded way. He was making literal, architectural room for a mind that had outgrown the version of itself required by court and courtroom. The tower didn't end his relationships. It simply changed which ones survived the climb up the stairs. That's the part the arrogant story always misses. A withdrawal like this isn't a wall built to keep people out. It's closer to a room built so someone can finally hear their own thinking over the noise, and the fact that fewer people are invited into that room isn't rejection. It's architecture. But architecture has a cost, and the cost is where the real discomfort lives. Solitude chosen for depth can curdle, almost without warning, into isolation chosen out of fear, and from the inside. The two can feel identical for a long stretch before anyone, including the person living it, can tell them apart. Attachment researchers draw a careful line between someone who withdraws because closeness once went badly for them, and someone who withdraws because they've finally earned the standing to ask for closeness on their own terms instead of whatever terms were offered. The behavior looks the same from across the room. What's happening underneath it is not. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard spent much of his writing life worried about a related danger, the way an individual can dissolve into what he called the public, trading the sharp, specific edges of a self for the comfort of being indistinguishable from everyone around them. His fear wasn't of solitude. It was of a self so thoroughly absorbed into a crowd that there was nothing left underneath to withdraw to. That's the quiet risk sitting on the other side of this pattern. A person can retreat into what looks like depth and find, once they arrive, that the room is empty, that the false self was doing more of the actual living than anyone realized, and there's less of a true self waiting underneath than the whole withdrawal assumed. So the honest question was never whether disappearing like this is healthy or unhealthy, brave or avoidant. It's this. Is the silence protecting something that's finally getting room to grow, or hiding something that was never given the chance to be looked at directly? Most people who vanish this way can't answer that quickly. The ones who claim they can are often still performing. Just for a smaller audience now. Themselves. What rarely gets said is that this kind of disappearing is almost never permanent in the way it looks from the outside. People who withdraw like this tend to return, eventually, but they return differently. Smaller circles. Longer gaps between contact. A noticeably lower tolerance for performing a warmth they don't actually feel. They come back not as the version of themselves that made them easy to keep around, but as whatever had been standing underneath that version the entire time. Which leaves one question worth carrying longer than the moment it's asked. When someone finally stops performing the self a room once needed from them, and comes back only as who they actually are, would the room still recognize them enough to let them back in?